I wanted to say, you talked about something about the spirit part, and not everyone can knows how to do this. So, what would you suggest? Am I free to ask these questions now that we're recording?
Sure, yeah. I mean, in a sense, and obviously, I'm happy to share publicly what my process has been with God in understanding marriage, divorce, relationships in general, because I've obviously shared publicly where I am in all this. So, in a sense, in my conversations with God, God indicated that the legal position of marriage is not necessarily what he sees as marriage, because two people can go through vows and sign a piece of paper, but it doesn't necessarily mean the fullness of marriage that he's intended. It's just a legal document.
Wow.
So from that perspective, when I was talking to him about my own situation and where I am in my own situation, and am I married or not married before him, although legally I'm still married until divorced, then basically he said, no, you're not married. Before me, that marriage has ended because your wife left you. She didn't want to be married to you. Therefore, I do not consider you married anymore, which obviously then, that challenged me to think about my own position. And, as I've shared before, I was in a position where I just can't be bothered. It's just like, I'm the age I am. Can I really be bothered with pursuing a relationship again? And some of that probably came out of maybe the disappointment of the previous relationship, I guess. But also, I just thought, I'm happy. I'm happy with my life. I'm happy with God. I'm happy with where I am. And then God spoke to me and said, that's a selfish attitude. That's selfish. And I thought, well, how can that be selfish? He said, well, because do you think you can make someone else happy? And I just hadn't considered that aspect of it. I was thinking about myself. I'm okay. But he said, no, you can make someone else happy. And of course, you can be happy in a relationship. So that really challenged me. And I did sort of shift my thinking, and then was open to a relationship as God opened it up or directed it. And eventually, that worked. But so when it then came to what is marriage, and I was talking to God about it, he said, it is the total surrender of two people, spirit, soul, and body, to one another. And therefore, one without the other two does not make a full marriage from God's perspective. Has to be the three. And the spiritual component, obviously an emotional component, when you fall in love and you have those emotional feelings of love, which are beautiful and wonderful. And, if you have that first love type feeling, the same thing that we can have with God in intimacy, when we open our first love gate, we have to open our first love gate to the person we're going to marry, or the person we're going to be in a relationship with. Because if you keep that first love gate closed to them, they're not going to have access to your spirit. So it's a choice to open your heart and open your first love gate to engage your spirit with their spirit, so that you can begin to engage spirit to spirit and also heart to heart. So the emotions of feeling in love and being in love and all of those wonderful emotions that God's given us are all actually part of that process. And then ultimately giving your body to one another. So you can, and if you don't give all three, then really you're not fully embracing what God intended a marriage to be, or a relationship to be. Forget the term marriage. Think about it as the relationship between two people who are in love with one another. And God views that being in love, but giving each other spirit, soul, and body, as a full marriage or a full relationship, as he intended people to have. Because no one married Adam and Eve, did they? It's like Eve was obviously brought out of Adam, and they were put together to become one again. Yeah. So that was really God's intention. So I think people understand some of the emotions and they understand the physical side, obviously, the consummation physically of a marriage, but they probably don't understand the nature of surrendering and giving access to your spirit. So, so that's what I chose to do. I chose to give access to my spirit and to engage my spirit, to engage my heart, and to engage my whole being, because that's what God showed me. So for me, that was part of the journey of discovering. And I was able to engage that because I know what to do in the spirit realm, and then when that's reciprocated and you get two people connected in that way, then there's this two-way flow of life and love and communication and everything else. So some people would say when you physically make love or have sex, then you're married before God, and you're not, because that can be a physical act. You can't say someone who rapes someone is married with that person. They're not. I know there's a component that can have, an interactive effect spiritually, but you're not. You have to choose to surrender yourself with the emotions and the spirit. So just the physical act is a physical act without the other two parts of it. So it's important to get the balance. Now, we often talk about a three-stranded cord is not easily broken, Ecclesiastes, talking about marriage. And I would say a three-stranded cord is not actually enough. You need a 9-stranded cord. You need your spirit, soul, and body, your partner's spirit, soul, and body, and God's Father, Son, and Spirit entwined together. Because then God is in the midst of the whole of your being and the whole of your partner's being, so that you're one with him and each other. And I think that is what God considers marriage. And the piece of paper or the vows, church-wise or culturally, whether it's a civil wedding or a church wedding, that doesn't make a marriage, because you can say all those vows and actually break them the next day, But so when you give it to each other, spirit, soul, and body, that is what God considers two people becoming one. And therefore, the cultural convention, the religious convention, although I'm not against having vows before God or anything else at all, if that's what people want to do, but that doesn't necessarily make someone married from God's perspective in the fullness of what he intends it to be. And of course, a piece of paper doesn't actually stop people ending up getting divorced, does it? It's just, so ultimately I do feel that God has and intends the spiritual component of the marriage or the relationship is very vital. And unless you know how to surrender access to your spirit and your heart, then you're going to be independent. There will be a degree of independence, which will mean you can't be fully one. Now, you don't become less than you are when you enter into that sort of relationship. You become more than you are, because you embrace what your partner carries, and that enhances what you carry, and you are more than the sum of the parts. So two independent people, when they become in a relationship that God considers marriage, that relationship is more than the sum of the two independent people's parts, because something happens when you come together, spirit, soul, and body, which creates a dynamic which increases the measure you have, because then you have agreement, full agreement, where obviously Jesus talks about agreement. When two agree, nothing's impossible. So when two are fully become one in agreement, then actually what you can do together is way more than you can do apart or independently. So ultimately, being a single person is a picture of being independent and essentially following the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in one sense, because God never intended people to be single. Either obviously with him, he intends them to have relationships, so we would never be on our own, but also he made us for relationship with each other and various sorts of relationship. Obviously, there's parental relationships, there's brotherly relationships, there's friendship relationships, there's lots of levels of relationship, and there's a full consummated relationship in which spirit, soul, and body are united with two people in full agreement and surrender. So I think that's really what God looks at it as. And he is not looking at whether you got a piece of paper or whether you got married in church or civilly. He's looking at whether you've surrendered spirit, soul, and body. Because you can do all the rest, and if you don't do that, really, it's not going to work as God intends it to work. So there's a lot more to it. And I think God is deconstructing our views of many things, both culturally and religiously, to see what is all this about. And I think the relationship between two people should pattern the relationship with God. So in my relationship with God, there was a process of coming into a level of intimacy, which was the garden of the heart, in which God met me in the garden of the heart, and he looked into my eyes and he expressed his desire for me. He wanted me. He expressed that whole level of relationship when he looked into my eyes in the garden of my heart. As in Psalm 23, I lay down with the shepherd of my soul, in green pastures beside quiet waters, which is heaven and earth coming together, which is really what that's talking about. And in that time, he began to restore my soul, and he began to make me whole, and he began to open up what relationship with him is all about, therefore showing me that it was unconditional love. Unconditional love is exactly that, no conditions. So God was showing me that he loves me unconditionally, which is a choice that he's made. Then you go through the dance floor, which was an entwining of emotions in which he hugged me. Father, Son, and Spirit hugged me at various times over a 6-month period. And I learned more about who they were from that cardiogenosis infusion than I did from all the other times where we'd had sort of conversations and stuff, because it was a heart to heart. It was deeper. And that entwining together on the dance floor was an unveiling of my destiny as a son in relationship to Father, Son, and Spirit. And of course, when you do that together with a person and you look into each other's eyes and you see the desire that you have and you express the desire that you have for that person, then you are then opening that up for then that relationship to become our destiny together. Because you're then saying it's not just me and my destiny, just as you do with God on the dance floor, it is our destiny together. I don't want to do anything other than I see the Father doing. So that then takes you to the soaking room, in which the soaking room is the time of preparation for the bridal chamber. And for me, that soaking room was my dark cloud experience, separating soul and spirit, reintegrating soul and spirit, making me whole and one, quantumly entangled with God, with my soul and spirit. So that whole process, like Esther, went through the process of being purified with the purified oils, essential oils and perfumes, so she'll be ready to go in and see the king. And that's what we go through with God, in that he takes us through a process of transformation, renewing our mind, healing our heart, dealing with anything which is a hindrance and an obstacle to our relationship with God. And then you go into a bridal chamber. No, we're not talking about a sexual thing with God, obviously, but we're talking about becoming one. Whoever's joined to the Lord is one spirit with him. So when I went through the process of purification, and I went through the process of separating soul and spirit and all of that, which took a number of years, then the level of intimacy I had with God, Father, in heaven, and then in multi-dimensions of heaven, and me then being free to realize that I was a multi-dimensional being and not just limited to heaven and earth, then that totally opened up my experience to go into the eternal now of God, to go into time, outside of time and space, to go into the place of being in his name, within Yod Hey Vav Hey, within the thing of being in the light, in the realm of perfection, face to face, heart to heart, mind to mind. It just took it to a whole different level of intimacy. And I do believe that's what God intends the parallel to be when we're in a relationship with somebody that is intended for that level of relationship. So you've got to go through the point. If you can't look into a person's eyes and say, I want you, I want to give myself to you, then ultimately the relationship is never going to fully work. Then if you then don't entwine emotionally and you fall in love and you enter into a love relationship, because the first one is unconditional love. I choose to give myself to you. I choose to love you, whether you love me back or not at that moment. But by me choosing to do that, then that opens up the opportunity for someone else to do that in return. And I think then at that time is when you engage with your spirit. You know, you would choose to open your first love gate. You would choose to surrender your spirit to their spirit and their spirit to your spirit, so you can connect emotionally, spiritually, and there's no barriers, there's no closed areas, there's nothing there which is a hindrance to entering into the fullness of the relationship ultimately. Because obviously you got to get to know one another, but that process is not a time thing. You could get to know someone in 2 months fully because you surrendered. Or if you don't surrender and you're cautious and you're holding back, then it could take 6 months, it could take a year, it could take longer to truly get to know someone if both of those people are holding back. So you've got to, in a sense, the more you surrender and engage spirit and soul, then the easier it is to then know one another to a point where you know you're totally committed to one another, and then you can enter into the fullness of a relationship. The bridal chamber with God was so intimate. And if you enter into the bridal chamber with the person that you want to be with and you're intending to be with in front of God, whether that's in front of people or not, that's another issue. But before God, you have to have surrendered spirit, soul, and body. Otherwise, you're going to hold back from one another that which you're going to become one with. So there's a whole process there which I think goes beyond our convention culturally and our convention religiously, so that we can actually find what God views marriage as, rather than what we've been conditioned by a programming to see marriage as. And so you can get a piece of paper, and it doesn't mean that you're really married before God if you've not surrendered spirit, soul, and body, because he wants us to be one, not independent. You leave and you cleave. You leave that single state and you come together and you cleave with one another until you become one. And that's the process. And I think the process starts with the emotions, the choice to love unconditionally. Then it goes through the falling in love, which you then begin to open up your spirit and engage. And I know probably is not a fixed way of doing that, a pattern. I think you could probably do that, whenever, but you have to choose to do it, So I chose, to open up my first love gate, and I chose to engage my spirit. And therefore that engaging opened up a whole different dimension to a relationship. So, ultimately, I think the spiritual part of it is really, really important, because I think that is what triggers the depth of emotion of really falling in love, which is not superficial lust or just superficial sort of giddy sort of schoolboy emotions type thing, but real emotions, which are based in that total surrender and giving of yourself and wanting the best for the other person. It's not selfish. That's why choosing to love unconditionally is wanting the best for the other person. But then as you trust each other, then you trust that both will be able to do that together and grow. And then it will just grow and grow and grow deeper and deeper and deeper, because you've got no barriers and you're holding nothing back. So, that's how I would see how God has sort of shown me, what this pattern can look like, how this pattern can be mirroring our pattern with God in intimacy with a person, so that we would be like we are with God, but as we are in a relationship with each other. So, yeah.
Is it whose responsibility is it to initiate all of this? Because what we are conditioned to believe is that it's the man that's supposed to start all of this. So what if the man is not really in the place to be able to do that kind of spiritual work? What happens then?
Well, I don't think God sees anything in terms of male or female. I know the church has traditionally taught man is the head and all of that. I don't believe that. I don't believe the Bible scriptures that they quote in Ephesians 5 actually talks about submission to the woman, to the husband. It's about mutual submission to one another in the filling of being filled with the Spirit. Nothing to do with subjugating women under men. So I'm a total feminist when it comes to women's rights and women, because we're equal. And in the kingdom, there's no male or female. So I don't see that one should take the initiative at all. It could be either. What matters is that both choose to enter into the relationship. And if the woman is further ahead spiritually and understands how to engage their spirit with the man, in doing that, it will open up his heart and it will open up his spirit to her and for him to respond, which is exactly what I learned to do by engaging my spirit. Just like when I engage my spiritual spheres of authority and I expend my spirit around those spheres of authority so I have access to them, I can do that with a person. And I can open up my spirit, surround them, create a safe place for them to be able to pursue a relationship safely, knowing that I care, that I am committed in that relationship in the spirit. And then things then can develop. And if one person knows how to do that, do it. If two people know how to do it, great, even better. If the other person knows how to do it, and it's not male or female, there's no male or female in God's perspective in kingdom. Of course, we're different and we have different ways of functioning, and that's why we become one. That's why Adam and Eve came from out of one, didn't it? You know, Eve wasn't created independently of Adam. Eve was drawn out of Adam and separated from what was one so they could become one in a different way. So that was God's intention. They would become one again in a different way than they were before. And I think we both should have male and female components of how we think and not be seeing fully separated. And I think there's too much about, the male and female, which actually divides rather than unites. And I think let's just forget the names and let's be in a relationship and be one, because that's what's really going to work. But I know a lot of people wouldn't know how to engage their spirit. I mean, a lot of Christians don't even know how to engage their spirit with God, really. Yeah. So this is something which I think is vital for our relationship with God to enter through the process of, garden of the heart, dance floor, soaking room, and eventually bridal chamber. And also the same if we're going to enter into a relationship with someone else. Now, that being said, God may have celibacy for somebody and he may choose that for them. But I think that's the exception, not the rule. And certainly, God does not want us to be alone. If we are, of course, he's with us in that relationship. And it may not be that everyone is in a relationship with somebody else, but God can be for them what they need. And at the end of the day, if God isn't what we need primarily, then we're going to try and draw from the other person that which they can never give. And that's a really bad thing when someone is trying to get someone else to meet their needs that only God can meet. Because in that type of relationship, it becomes often obsessive and sometimes abusive when someone is trying to get someone else to meet all their needs. When God is the only one who can fully meet our needs, then what we have in relationship is additional to that, and we don't try and get from each other that which we can only get from God. because that creates a big problem in relationships.
Yeah.
God is primarily is the one who meets our needs. When we're in a relationship with other, we complement each other to enhance everything that we're receiving from God. That's important, I think.
So how do you help people who don't yet know how to do this spiritual work now? Like if I see someone trying to get married or get involved, and
Well,
how
you help them in the same way that you help anyone else to engage God. You help them choose to do it by choice, and you help them picture what they're doing in opening a door and allowing the person to come in. Just as you open your first love gate and allow God to come in, God doesn't force his way in, so that each person can be encouraged to make a choice to open the door to the spirit of the other person and to the heart of the other person. So we open the door into our spirit and we open the door into our heart. Therefore, we then become one in spirit and in heart, and then that then can follow on eventually to come one in body as well. Now, I wouldn't encourage anyone to try and engage in physical intimacy without having first engaged the heart and the spirit, because that is not the order which God does it. God does it and brings you to the bridal chamber after the process is complete, not before the process starts. You know, and a lot of people, their physical side of a relationship is lust. That's not love. Lust is not the motive for entering into a physical relationship. The physical side of it would come once the spirit and the soul have come together, which then opens the door for the process to take place, which brings about purification and refining of heart and motives. So then when you do become one, it's not selfish. You're not there to meet your own needs or have your own needs met. You're there for the other person, not for yourself. Now, of course, in a reciprocating relationship, they're there for you, but you've got to do it unconditionally. You can't do it. Well, I'm going to do this if you do that. That's not how it works. It's got to be a choice. Now, when that is a mutual choice and you both choose to do that together, and that's the consummation of when spirit and soul have become one. But don't ever do that first, because that is a recipe for disaster, because you then are essentially looking to meet your physical needs before your spiritual and emotional needs are connected. You are become one spiritually and emotionally, which is not a good thing to do, and then can lead to all sorts of problems. So it's definitely the right order as God directs it. That it takes place. But, I think just as you would engage God and help people engage God by opening their first love gate, do the same with a person. I've done marriage courses with quite a number of people. I've married quite a number of people. I would not do those marriage courses in any way the same way as I would have done them in the past with what I know now. Yeah. So I would definitely do it differently. And I would always look to engage the choice. And again, it isn't time. You can come to that point of surrender after 2 weeks. You could come to that point after 2 months. You could come to that point after 6 months. It isn't the amount of time, it's what happens within the time where you have engaged. And I think that is the key. That level of engagement and that level of interaction and that level of communication and love that flows when two people have made that commitment to love one another unconditionally, but also then fall in love and enter into a I am in love type relationship, which then all of the fullness of the emotions are part of that relationship. But it always must remain unconditional. Otherwise, it isn't love. True love can only be unconditional. Because as soon as you put conditions on it, it's not love, it's earning something or a reward for something. And that's not what God intends. God does not want us to be rewarding each other because of our behavior. Love is unconditional. When you love one another, irrespective of what's coming back. But ultimately, obviously, when that is functioning correctly, you are flowing in love, one to the other. And it's a pattern, the same thing as it is with God. There's a flow of relationship we have between us and God. Okay.
Thank you.
Right. Tish, you got your hand up there.
It was Inga first. Inga,
Oh,
do you
was it?
want to go first? Yeah.
You took hers down, but she can have it up again.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I thought I'd wait. Okay.
Okay. Oh, you want to ask? You can go ahead, Inga, and then I'll come later.
Well, it's just that my question is a completely different subject. So I thought if you had something connected with what we heard, I can take mine next time. It's okay.
Okay. All right. I
Yeah.
think my basically is the understanding the soul's journey in connection with everything, because what you just described is like, or what we are discussing now, I'm seeing the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in it as a flow in marriage as well, bringing the spirit, soul, and body into connection with each other, and what you describe as the joining of the man, the woman, and the heavenly body, which is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, in that nine strong and string. I'm just yeah, and it's making me question the journey of the soul on earth. The soul that doesn't meet their, I don't want to use the word soulmate.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. In a sense, the soul is the area which is damaged and has memory of the past. And so the soul is probably the area which needs the most work in the soaking room preparation for coming together fully, is that soul area. Because if this person is fearful, or the person has in the past basically have been hurt or damaged emotionally, or in relationships, whether they be relationships, in parental relationships, or whether they be relationships of previous marriage or previous relationships with somebody, if the person has hurt, or if the person has fear, or if the person is holding back, or if they have sadness from the past, then God would want to heal that, so that that is not there to trigger the relationship. Part of the problem is people get triggered by things that someone says, because of it triggers the memory of what someone else said or did, and that person may not mean that at all, but they're triggering a memory which is a neural pathway linked to some sort of trauma or some sort of previous event, and you have to deal with those triggers. Otherwise, then the emotions which are unhealed will begin to affect the relationship, because you'll be reading into what someone else says what they don't mean. And you may then feel that you need to withdraw or protect yourself from somebody because you're fearing that they're going to act the same way that someone else has acted in the past. And you can therefore keep some of your heart guarded from them because you're afraid it's going to get hurt.
Yeah.
And that is only going to mean there's barriers between you, which eventually God will want to remove. But obviously, the more you can do in removing those barriers and being open and honest and transparent in the relationship, to say when there's a trigger, or when you're feeling insecure, or when someone's perhaps said something that has made you feel insecure and you don't know why, you're doubting their commitment, or maybe you're doubting something, that's usually because it's triggered some sort of memory from something in a previous relationship, which is still there, which is why God would want to take you through the process of healing you, restoring you, making you whole. But that's so much easier when you're able to talk about it, and we're able to say, when you said that, I felt this. And then pursue asking God why you felt that. Because the person will be probably like, I didn't mean that. I don't know what you heard, but that's not what I was saying. And that's often the case in a relationship. Someone hears what you're not saying and then misunderstands what you're saying and then extrapolates that into something negative and then gets defensive or sometimes offensive. They get aggressive. It's like they go on the attack because they feel that they're going to be hurt or they're going to be upset. And all of that is because of the lack of communication, of actually sharing what you feel when you're triggered so that you can work it through. You know, and all of us will have some sort of triggers that will make you feel insecure, make you feel sad, make you feel angry, you know, make you feel doubt, whatever it might be. But understanding, becoming self-aware is recognizing the emotions that you're feeling and sharing them, not hiding them or burying them or using them to put up a barrier, because that is going to stop the communication and that will stop the healing that needs to come. Because 99% of the time, the person that you're being triggered is not actually meaning what the trigger is indicating. It's just a word or a look or something triggered that. And that's obviously the soul needs to be restored and made whole as far as possible. I'm not saying that we'd ever be completely free from everything initially, but the more you grow, the easier it is for those things to be shared and talked about and then worked through and understood. And then the other person can be sensitive to you and be careful in what they say and how they say it until that no longer is an issue. And obviously God would want to remove that completely, so it's no longer an issue to you. You know, which means then you won't be triggered again. And that means replacing the neural pathway to the negative memory to a positive affirmation, you know, so that you don't spiral down a pattern of thinking and behavior. You then take captive the thought, line it up to the mind of Christ, if you like, to the living word of God, a living active word of God, and then find the correct understanding of what was said or what will happen. You know, this is obviously a process that you have to work through. And, you know, you've got to be understanding of each other during the process. Because, you know, if someone is triggered and they go quiet and they withdraw, then the other person won't know why they're withdrawing and will probably feel something. You know, now sometimes you don't understand why you're triggered. So the best thing to do is saying, I'm feeling something right now. I need to have some space to figure out what it is. I need to talk to God about it. So I'm not sure I can explain it to you properly. But be open and communicate that that's why you're needing a bit of space to work it out, not just withdraw and emotionally withdraw so that the other person feels what's going on. Why are they moody or why are they quiet? And always think the best of one another. You know, that's one of the primary things in relationship. Think the best, not the worst. Don't assume someone's being negative or being hurtful. Don't make that assumption. Make the assumption is, if I'm feeling something, I'm sure they didn't intend it. So it's my issue to identify why I'm feeling it, not to go on the attack and telling them how horrible they are or how bad they were for making you feel bad, because I'm sure they didn't intend it. So that's where the communication and the openness and the honesty and the willingness to be vulnerable with one another comes in. And it obviously, relationships take time, particularly if you're older, like most of us are. It's like, you know, we've got a history. Now, the more you can do with God in dealing with the things that are in your heart, the easier it is when it comes to a relationship with somebody else, because you're much more self-aware and, you know, understand yourself better on how you react in certain situations. And don't let the negative thoughts go round your mind, because then you're meditating on negativity, which will then become manifest in how you're behaving. and how you're feeling, and the fear that will come in. Fearing, oh, the person's going to do, what are they going to do? And, as soon as you start to see your mind having those negative thoughts, take them and cast them all on the Lord and allow him to give you perspective on why you're feeling what you're feeling and what was at the root to it, so that can be removed. So your mind can be renewed, your heart can be healed, and then you're much more likely to be able to enter into a relationship in a way, because you've chosen to be honest and open and transparent, and you can hold each other accountable for that, which is what you do. You can't force accountability on someone, but you can say, look, if I'm ever acting in a way that makes you feel insecure, then speak to me about it and ask me what's going on. And you can both do that. And then you give each other permission to be able to ask the questions to bring the culture of honor into place, where you're not looking at attacking one another or looking at each other as the problem. You're both addressing to identify what the problem is, so the problem can be dealt with, which is not about trying to score points against one another in a way, which has become what happened in a relationship if you're not careful. So then communication and openness and also transparency is really where the relationship sort of stands, and it enables that relationship to grow deeper and deeper, because you get to know each other better, and you understand each other better, and therefore you have more grace and mercy and love for one another, because you realize that both parties are in a process of being restored and made whole, so that the relationship can be full and complete. But it's not easy, obviously, because we've all got history,